Working. Fabulous. So before we jump into the Torah study for today, why don't we start as we always do with our blessing over Torah. Yada-dai-dai-dai-dai-dai. 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 Yada-dai-dai-dai-dai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lasok b'divrei Torah Lasok b'divrei Torah, hafoch ba, lasok b'divrei Torah. Yada-dai-dai-dai-dai-dai. 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 Yada-dai-dai-dai-dai. Hi, Steve. So good that you could join us after all.
My patient got postponed for hours, so I can squeeze it in.
Awesome. Well, it's
best I could.
Great. Well, it's so good to be here with all of you. And as we know, as we're jumping into the Torah portion for today, we're starting the book of Deuteronomy. And in starting this book, the book of Deuteronomy doesn't really contain any new stories. What it contains are new understandings and perhaps different narratives around things that have happened to the Jewish people. And so there's kind of Moses's dialogue to the people, reminding them, giving them the little nuggets of wisdom that he hopes that people Israel will take as they walk into the promised land, because he knows he will not be there with them. He will not be able to say these stories. So he wants to make sure they are hammered into the minds of the Israelites because they're important and because our people is built in part on stories. But as we go into this particular portion, there are so many different things we can go into, of course, because there's so many different facets of the stories that Moses brings up in this portion. But the piece that I'm bringing in is actually a retelling of the story from Shoftim, where the scouts, the spies, were sent into the land of Israel. And there, a few weeks ago, this wasn't all that long ago, right, that we talked about this story. We talked about the fact that there were 10 spies who came back who said, well, the people of the land are like giants. We're like grasshoppers in relation to them. We can't possibly go into the land of Israel. And the Israelites start freaking out and say, we can't go in there. We can't do this. And Caleb and Joshua are trying to calm them down and saying, no, we can go in. It's okay. Like this is what we're supposed to be doing. But the Israelites become so worked up because the people of the land are giants, Anakim, that they end up wandering around the land for many, many more years. And so today we're going back to this because there are things in our Torah portion that bring up this idea of the giants in a new light. So we're revisiting some of these old things. Before we do, are there any questions or comments just on all of that? You look like you have something to say, Steve.
Oh, no, I'm trying to relax. It was so stressful getting here.
Oh, okay. Well, relax away. Sorry today has been so hard. And Ray, hi, good to have you here. Okay.
Hi.
So this is just a narrative at first. This is straight out of this week's Torah portion for the very end of this week's Torah portion. Would anyone like to read the first few verses?
I'll read it.
Thanks, Larry.
We made our way up the road toward Bashan, and King Og of Bashan, with all his men, took the field against it at Edrei. But the Lord said to me, do not fear him, for I am delivering him and all his men and his country into your power. And you will do to him as you did to Shiho, king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon. So the Lord our God also delivered into our power King Og of Bashan, with all his men, and we dealt them such a blow that no survivor was left. At that time, we captured all his towns. There was not a town that we did not take from them. 60 towns, the whole district of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Bashan. All those.
Okay, so let's stop for okay. Let's stop for just a second, because as we're reading through all of this, right, you might be saying, what does this have to do with giants at all? I promise it's coming. This is just kind of like the background of what's going on, because the only descriptions we have are that King Og is the king of Bashan, but there's a lot more that's coming.
Question for you. Where's Heshbon?
It's, I mean, in the general vicinity. I don't have a map in here. It's a good question, and it would be helpful if someone is really quick and kind of bringing up a map or something like that of this. That would be awesome. I don't have it right at my disposal, but it is a really good question, Ezra. I mean, these are places that are not far from Israel.
Usually to the southeast.
Yeah, let's continue more. And if anyone does find it, I don't want you to, not be able to participate. If anyone does find it, let me know. If not, we can try to find it after this class.
All these towns were fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, apart from a great number of unwalled towns. We doomed them as we had done in the case of King Shihon of Heshbon. We doomed every town, men, women, and children, and retained as booty all the cattle and the spoils of the town. Thus we seized at that time through two Amorite kings the country beyond the Jordan, from the Wadi Arnon to Mount Hermon. Sidonians called Hermon Sion, and the Amorites called it Senua. All the towns of the tableland and the whole of Gilead and Bashan, as far as Salach and Edrei, the towns of Og's kingdom in Bashan. Only King Og of Bashan was left of the remaining Rephaim. Yeah, his bedstead, an iron bedstead, is now in Rabbah of the Ammonites. It is 9 cubits long, pretty big, and 4 cubits wide by the standard cubic.
Okay, so I threw a lot of names at you there. Sorry about that, Larry, but you handled it with absolute grace. Thank you. And I know that last week and the week before, we also were diving into texts that included a lot of kind of war and bloodshed. And here we have a little bit of that, but that's not going to be our main focus. Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Heshbon is due east of the northern tip of the Dead Sea, in what is now Jordan, obviously.
Thank you. Great.
Dr. Google helps.
Yes. Thank you so much. I couldn't do that while sharing screen, so I really, really appreciate it. All right. So does anyone know anything about the Rephaim?
No.
Remember that name ever coming up before?
No.
Okay, so I want us just to kind of hold on to that for a second. And as you were reading, Larry, there was this description of Og's bedstead, right? Mm-hmm. Being 9 cubits by 4 cubits. That's really, really big.
Yes.
So if that's really big and that's his bed, what does that say about Og?
Is the Rephaim giants, or the ones who made it with the giants?
Yes, yes. So Rephaim, basically there are a few different groups in the Torah that are giants. Rephaim is one of them. So it's saying, here is this guy Og. He's the king of Bashan. He's a giant. But from reading the text up until this point, there is no indication in this text that there's any fear because he is a giant, is there?
Right. Yep.
And so that can kind of bring our story from earlier on with the scouts in a slightly different context. And as we go through a few more texts in which there are other giants, we might have to ask ourselves the question, of why the Israelites were so scared of the giants in the land of Israel when they don't seem to be scared of giants in many other battles. So Rephaim, people of enormous stature. That's the definition that comes out of the Jewish Encyclopedia. Basically, there's the Anakim. Anak is the Hebrew word for giant, for those of you who have that Hebrew vocabulary. So the Anakim, the Rephaim, and the Nephilim, who we're going to move into in just a second. And they're all giants. It's unclear of their relationships to one another. There are all sorts of debates about exactly how they're related. I didn't find anything definitive when I was going through. I just saw contradictory texts and understandings. But it's clear that there's some sort of relation between them. Yeah, Steve.
To keep this in context of the time, in one of the books that was from the Dead Sea Scrolls, where it describes the battle between David and Goliath. Goliath is described as being 4 cubits tall, not 6 cubits like it is in our contemporary book of Joshua. 4 cubits means he was 6 feet tall. And in those days, that was a giant, because the average man in those days was maybe 5'2" to 5'4". So,
and that's great to bring that in, Steve. Thank you. We're going to get to Goliath a little bit later in our text study. We are going there because we couldn't have the study talking about giants and not bring him in, right?
Right.
But I want to start just by backtracking a little bit to the first instance in the Torah where there are people who are giants, and that would be Genesis 6. Does anyone want to just read these 4 verses?
I could read it, sir.
Thanks, Serv.
When men began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them, the divine beings saw how beautiful the daughters of men were and took wives from among those that pleased them. Yeah. The Lord said, my breath shall not abide in man forever, since he too is flesh. Let the days allowed to him be 120 years. It was then and later too that the Nephilim appeared on earth. When the divine beings cohabitated with the daughters of men, bore them offspring, they were the heroes of old, the men of renown.
Okay, so what do we know about these Nephilim then?
this is so Greek.
It really is, isn't it? It definitely feels that way. It feels very outside of our tradition, but then again, we're influenced by surrounding traditions. And there's a lot written about that in this context as well. So what do we know about the Nephilim?
They live to be 120 years old, which is a number we use a lot today.
And a number that is connected to Moses, which is a big deal, right?
Yeah.
And they are the children of gods or divine beings, whatever that means. We don't quite know what that means. Divine beings and human beings. They are the children of both. Half divine, half human. Not that humans aren't divine, but it means something different here. So, yeah. Sorry, what did you say?
They didn't live on Mount Olympus.
Right. There's no mention of Mount Olympus, that is for sure. Or of Percy Jackson. I have a son who's very into those books. Yeah, but there's something that definitely feels like Greek or even Roman mythology kind of stuff here of this coming together. There's something that isn't quite human about them, that is perhaps scarier, perhaps more full of strength or something else. And so they kind of pop up here. Wait a second, there's a really important text that I'm now scared got deleted from my text study. Oh no, it did. All right, I will have to find a way to bring that in still. That's upsetting. I must have accidentally deleted it, but we will go back to that in a second. Let's look at the text from Shoftim, from the Torah portion that we studied a few weeks ago, where the giants came in, where all of the Israelites were saying, there's giants, we can't go in there. So I'll just read this one quickly. Caleb hushed the people before Moses and said, let us by all means go up and we shall gain possession of it, it meaning the land, of course, for we shall surely overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we cannot attack that people, for it is stronger than we. Thus they spread calumnies among the Israelites about the lands that they had scouted, saying, the country that we traversed and scouted is one that devours its settlers. All the people that we saw in it are men of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. Okay, so it's going back to this earlier text. The Anakites, the giants, are part of the Nephilim. And we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them. So it's not only the size that they're bringing in, but the Nephilim and being described as part divine and part human, there's another element there that feels a little, that might feel a bit scary.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, if we go a little bit further, we heard a lot of names within this earlier text that we had, but we'll go back to them in just a little bit. But from Joshua, it says, Caleb dislodged from there the three Anakites, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, descendants of Anak. So basically it's saying Anak, giants, had children. And so like there's this interrelation of all of these different giants. Some of these names I believe will appear a little bit more later on. I'm so upset that okay, all right, it comes up here. So we will do it this way. I'm just really upset that one text disappeared on me. I must not have saved it as I thought I did. Let's go to this Talmud text right here. This comes from Nida. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, which is redacted 3rd to 6th century. There's a lot of debate about where exactly in there everything came from, but it's within that time period. So the Gemara, meaning the Talmud, cites another case of a report that caused concern. Before the battle against Og, king of Bashan, it is stated, and the Eternal said to Moses, do not fear him, for I have delivered him into your hand, and all his people and his land. And you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, the name was just mentioned a little while ago, who dwelt in Heshbon. The Gemara asks, now Sihon and Og were brothers. Okay, now we have a little bit of a relationship. As the master said, Sihon and Og were the sons of Ahijah, son of Shamhazi. In what way is Sihon different from Og? That God found it necessary to warn Moses not to be afraid of Og? And which way is Og different from Sihon? That there was no need for warning not to be afraid of Sihon, because remember earlier on, the mention is like, you had defeated Sihon, there was no problem there, but now there's this warning about Og. Rabbi Yochanan says that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, from the answer that God gave to the righteous one, Moses, you know what was in his heart, what gave Moses to cause to fear. Moses said to himself, perhaps the merit of our forefather Abraham will stand for Og and save him. Og was the one who told Abraham that Lot had been taken captive by the 4 kings, enabling Abraham to rescue Lot. So there's a coming together of all sorts of different things that we didn't know were related, right? The Gemara cites the source as this claim, as it is stated, and there came one that was saved and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he dwelt in the terebinths of Mamre, the Amorite brother of Eshcol, the brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318, and pursued as far as Dan. And Rabbi Yochanan said that the term that one that was saved is referring to Og, who was saved from the punishment of the generation of the flood. For this reason, Moses was more afraid of Og. So that's the piece that I inadvertently left out that I had meant to include in here, is there's this text that talks about, and maybe it'll appear somewhere else still, but that talked about how when Noah was on the ark, there was just Og from among the giants that was there, right? And what did Noah do? Noah punched a hole inside of the boat in order to be able to feed Og to keep him alive. And he was the last remaining one. Then, of course, if you say Shihon is brothers with Og and all of this other stuff, it becomes really confusing because what exactly is the timeline here? But the rabbis don't seem confused by any of that. Yes, go ahead.
I had one question.
Yeah.
What's the difference in the Gemara and the Mishnah?
Good question. So the Mishnah precedes the Gemara. The Gemara is another word for Talmud. Mishnah are earlier rabbinic texts, and the Gemara or the Talmud is really commentary based on the Mishnah.
Okay, I just wanted to know.
Yeah, it all falls under Talmud. Thank you for asking that question. It's a really good one. Any other questions? Because I know the way in which this Talmud text brings things together is it's a lot of like smushing different stories, and it's done very, very quickly. So any kind of thoughts or questions on this?
I was just confused about the part where it said that why was Og saved from punishment from the generation flood? Because obviously all the stuff that happened with Abraham was much farther in the future. So obviously he was saved for those reasons.
Yeah, and I'm going to look again to see if maybe it did make it into the text. Well, there's Og again, but not in the context that I wanted. Okay, well, there's this from the Book of Legends. Well, let's go through some of these other things about Og, and maybe that'll get to your question, Brian, okay? So one of them is coming from the Book of Legends. It didn't have a source beyond that, unfortunately, but it said, as the floodwaters swelled, Og, king of Bashan, sat himself on one of the rungs of the ark's ladders and swore to Noah and to his sons that he would be their slave forever. So it wasn't that he merited this place, it was that he was willing to be subservient in some way to Noah and to his sons so that he would live. And what did Noah do? He punched a hole, that should be hole with an H, not with a W, sorry about that, in the ark, and through it, he handed out food to Og every day, and Og's survival is intimated by the verse, only Og remained of the remnant of the Rephaim, which is the verse that comes from this week's Torah portion. There's a little bit more in terms of text about Og, so maybe we'll just skip around a little bit here by looking at one other text that comes from the Book of Legends. This is actually, the Book of Legends took two different midrashim, one from Genesis Rabbah and one from Deuteronomy Rabbah, and put them together in this text. That's what's going on here. So, and Abraham made a great feast. Rabbi Judah bar Rabbi Simon said, not a great feast, but a feast for great parsonages. Og and all other great ones like him were there. At that time, Og asked, did you not say, Abraham is like a barren mule and cannot beget a child? So this is obviously a little bit further into the future, talking about Abraham. Nevertheless, when Og looked at Isaac, he was able to reply, so this gift given to Abraham, what's it worth? Is not the creature a puny thing? Were I to put my finger upon him, I could crush him. The Holy One said to Og, how dare you belittle my gift? As you live, you will see thousands of myriads issue from his children's children. And it was at the hands of Isaac's descendants that this evil man, Og, was to fall. So it's according to these midrashim, Og wasn't saved because Og had great merit. He is not portrayed that way. Og was saved because Og was able to negotiate with Noah. According to these midrashim, and they're just midrashim, they're not straight from the Torah or anything like that. We can agree or disagree. We can create our own midrashim. That's totally fine. So am I totally losing you with all of this? Where is everyone? Any questions or thoughts?
So
I know this is a bit off the wall. It's kind of fun though, isn't it?
one thing I'm curious about when it comes to like legends in the Midrash is like, how do different, I guess, how different denominations of Jewish people view like the Midrash stories? Because I get from, you know, obviously we're taking the perception like, oh, take it with a grain of salt, but I'm curious if other people view it as like, because I know that Orthodox people tend to view a lot of the oral law as being handed down directly to Moses. So I was wondering just if it was as kind of canonical as the Torah is to them.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the thing is with Midrash, right, you can have multiple truths at the same time that are entirely contradictory to one another. Like, it's not possible to believe every Midrash that it's out there. There's real debates between the rabbis of what is meant here and what's meant there. And we've had some of those debates, right? Like talking about Balaam. Is he a prophet? Or is he this really terrible human being who's trying to destroy the people? Did he actually grow respect for the Jewish people, or did God just stop him from doing what he intended to do in that moment, right? The Midrashim, you can't actually believe both of them at the same time. One isn't necessarily more right than another. It's not canonical in the same way that the Torah text itself is, but it is part of the larger Jewish lore. So whatever sect of Judaism you're in, there's a knowledge base, perhaps, about the different midrashim that are out there, especially the more popular ones. And so they can show up in a variety of different ways, but it doesn't demand the same kind of belief that the Torah would for an Orthodox Jew. Did that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Any other thoughts here? Because I know I'm throwing out some crazy stuff today. Got to keep you on your toes.
We passed by what Malcolm Gladwell said.
Yeah, we're going to go to him. That's when we're talking about David and Goliath. I wanted to go to all of the stuff relating to Og before I got there. My text, I didn't realize, was far more out of order than I had intended it to be. So I apologize for that.
Just below there. Yeah.
Yes, I was just trying to see if there's one more text with Og. No, we actually kind of did go over that already. Okay, so one really quick text thrown in there from Samuel, which is the first allusion, of course, to Goliath. A champion of the Philistine forces stepped forward. His name was Goliath of Gath, and he was 6 cubits and a span tall. So I know that you were talking, Steve, about 4 cubits being kind of cited elsewhere. Here it says 6 cubits.
The 4 cubit reference is in one of the books that was not in the canon. But 4 cubits sounds much more credible than 6 cubits. That'd be plus 9 feet with the 6 cubits and a span.
Yes, but even before we go into this, because we're talking about cubits here, I'm going to give you something else, another text. This is out of the Talmud also, that is completely off the wall with regard to size. So how was Og killed, right? There's this whole thing about how is it that Og was ultimately killed. It said the descendants will be killed. The descendants of Isaac, rather, will kill Og in the end. And here it says, well, how tall was Moses? He was 10 cubits tall. He took an axe 10 cubits long, jumped up 10 cubits, and struck Og in the ankle and killed him.
Okay.
Or actually, this might be saying that Og was 10 cubits tall here. The he, it's so difficult to tell what the text is in the Talmud sometimes, because it just refers to everyone as he. And so which he are you referring to? So it could be that it wasn't Moses that actually was 10 cubits tall, but it was Og. And what did Moses do? He took an axe 10 cubits long, jumped up 10 cubits, and struck Og in the ankle and killed him.
In the ankle, jumping up.
In the ankle and killed him. That's quite an ankle injury right there, right?
Yes.
But somehow that's what happened. It's just a really interesting kind of side note there.
Podiatrist.
What?
You should have had a good podiatrist.
They didn't quite have those at that time.
Oh,
All right. Sorry, I'm jumping around just because I wanted to find the original text. I'm missing another text that I wanted in here. Darn, I don't know what happened to my text sheet. Okay, that's all right. We'll make with what we have. Let's look at Malcolm Gladwell's kind of description of the David and Goliath story, because it is a pretty good description. Does anyone want to just read the first paragraph here?
read if you like.
Thanks, that'd be great.
Quote, giants are not what we think they are. The same qualities that appear to give them strength are often the sources of great weakness. And the fact that being an underdog can change people in ways that often fail to appreciate. It can open doors and create opportunities and educate and enlighten and make possible what might otherwise have seemed unthinkable. We need a better guide to facing giants, and there is no better place to start that journey than with the epic confrontation between David and Goliath. When Goliath shouted out to the Israelites, he was asking for what is known as a single combat. This was common practice in the ancient world. Two sides of the conflict would seek to avoid the heavy bloodshed of open battle by choosing one warrior to represent each in a duel.
Okay, so just stopping for a second, there's this whole idea, and this happened often, and there's lots of different textual kind of pieces where this kind of battle takes place. So Goliath, this big guy covered with armor, is expecting another big guy covered in armor, and they will fight it out. And the person who wins, that will be the one who is victorious, and the people that is victorious. Okay, let's continue. Does anyone else want to pick up reading?
I can.
Great.
This is what Goliath was expecting, a warrior like himself to come forward for hand-to-hand combat. It never occurred to him that the battle would be fought on anything but those terms. He was prepared accordingly. So to protect himself against blows to the body, he wore an elaborate tunic made up of hundreds of overlapping bronze fish-like scales. It covered his arms and reached his knees and probably weighed more than 100 pounds. He wore a heavy helmet. He held a thrusting javelin that made entirely of bronze, which was capable of penetrating a shield or even armor. And you see why no Israelite would come forward to fight Goliath? ? Then David appeared. Saul tries to give him his own sword and armor so that at least he'll have a fighting chance. David refuses. I cannot walk in these, he says, for I'm unused to it. Instead, he reaches down, picks up 5 smooth stones, puts them in his shoulder bag, and he descends to the valley carrying his shepherd's staff. Goliath looks at the boy coming toward him and is insulted. He was expecting to do battle with a seasoned warrior. Instead, he sees a shepherd, a boy from one of the lowliest of all professions, who seems to want to use his shepherd's staff as a cudgel against Goliath's sword.
Okay.
What happens next is a matter of legend. David puts one of his stones into the leather pouch of his sling and fires at Goliath, exposed forehead. Goliath falls stunned. David runs toward him, seizes the giant's sword, and cuts off his head.
Okay, so what is going on in this story. And in the retelling, I know we don't have the original story, which I thought I had put into this text sheet. Something got messed up somewhere. But in this retelling that Malcolm Gladwell is putting out there, like, what is the message? What is he trying to get across through this story?
Well, Goliath is immobilized. He's a product of the old world, and it's a change in technology, change of way of fighting. And what he's saying is that the little guy doesn't necessarily has to be the smallest or the weakest. He's just the smartest. And he saw where he was exposed. And I read the books, so he goes into great detail.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated by this whole thing. I think he's a brilliant writer. And so that it's, I think the point is that, what we're talking about today is you don't be afraid of people just because they're bigger than you are. You can be smarter than them. And you find their weaknesses. And it's not an uncommon story, even the Hanukkah story, which is legend too, they just fought a different way using guerrilla tactics, and they defeated a giant army. So I think it's a similar kind of a point here. But
Thank you so much, Irv.
Isn't it that right can defeat might?
Well, that certainly is one of the underlying messages of the Hanukkah story, if you read it from the Maccabee perspective, right? And you're right, it could very well be the story here too. The bringing together of Hanukkah with this story, I think, is a really fascinating, coming together of ideas. So is there more you want to say about that, Jerry and Michael?
No,
Sorry.
that was just basically it. That to me, the story of Goliath, it's right versus might, and in the end, right wins out, which tends to give hope to people.
It is a story of hope for sure. Right. And I don't know how many of you have read this book of David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell. Are there a bunch of people who have read it? I read it. It had to be 5 or 6 years ago. So there's a lot that I do not have at the tip of my fingers, but I remember him talking quite a lot about how things are not always what they seem. How perhaps, even though the very stature of Goliath was so scary and all the armor and everything else was so scary, that size that Goliath had was actually a disadvantage in a lot of ways. Because what happens if you're that big you're wearing hundreds of pounds of armor? What happens? You can't move very fast. You're not agile. You can't get out of the way. You're clumsy. You could trip over your own feet. There are huge disadvantages that Goliath has that might not be visible. It could be visible actually, but it might not be the first kind of thing that comes to your mind if you were to see Goliath. I wouldn't want to meet up with Goliath and go into battle with him. I mean, and the Israelites clearly didn't either. But that David is able to say, look, I can't fight with him on his terms, but I can fight with him on mine. And that's what happens here. He changes the game entirely.
he also, in the book, talks about Goliath wanting David to come closer. And he thought maybe that he might not be able to see as well. And he talks to some condition that made reference to his vision that was caused physically. So David could stay outside of his range. He could only throw that spear so far. And and it gets into some very interesting detail. I found it so fascinating. And the rest of the book also.
Yeah, I mean, this is from the first chapter. So clearly this is just like a little smattering of details, but there's a lot of power there. And so if we look at this story, this reading by Malcolm Gladwell, if we look at the ways in which the Israelites seem to easily overcome giants in other parts of the Torah, then if we go back to the idea of the Shoftim, the scouts who are going into the land of Israel, we might have a lot of questions then about what really was going on. And I want us to have that conversation, but there's actually one last text to read, and then I'm going to shut down the screen share. This way we can just see each other's beautiful faces. And this is from Rabbi Elaine Zecher. It's actually a sermon that she wrote. This is a small piece of it. She writes, Goliath laughed and mocked David when he saw him advance with only a slingshot in his hand. David could have taken one look at the giant and thought, he's too big, how could I win? Instead, David recalibrated. He is so big, how can I miss? One rock and a slingshot, the rest is history, and a message for the future. David came running toward Goliath, powered by courage, ingenuity, and faith, with an innovative strategy to face his adversary. Goliath couldn't comprehend that his view of the world had been shattered, and it hit him right between the eyes. Perhaps we think our present and the future is some big Goliath staring us down with heavy armor, and we feel initially as vulnerable as David appeared. But the story of David offers us a new perspective. What drove David was the security he knew he already had to defend his people and to step forward. Armed with faith, ingenuity, and the courage to address the challenges before us, we can defeat any Goliath. So let's just stop here. And I see a couple people joined. Hi, Rivka, good to see you as well. Are there any initial comments or thoughts based on these texts? Yeah, go ahead, Ezra.
Why did he cut his head off? That's pretty graphic.
You're right. It is very graphic. And we remember also that it was a piece of the time. At that time, it was normal in battle, and not all that long ago historically, to cut off it happens in some places still, to cut off the head of someone who is a leader and to display that head as a way of displaying victory, kind of like a flag. It's gruesome, it's awful. I'm grateful that it is not a common practice today, but it definitely was timely.
I always think back to June 1948 when Israel faced all those Arab nations. I thought it's Goliath and David all over again. How possibly can the Haganah defeat all those people? It seemed impossible. Seemed absolutely impossible.
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely is another kind of part of the David and Goliath story. And this last piece of a sermon, by the way, was actually a sermon that was written for last year, towards still the beginning of the pandemic, of just talking about the Goliaths in our way as we faced it. I didn't include that piece of text in there, but that was the context of that sermon that she gave.
Just a quick note about the slingshot. Slingshot was a very, very skilled, weapon. It was not just somebody just picking up a rock and throwing it with a sling. It was people trained in using that thing because didn't have very many other weapons. So slingshot shouldn't be considered nothing. It's really something to be feared.
Yes, and in the story about David and Goliath, there is a little piece in there before it about how David was skilled with it. So it wasn't like he picked something off the street and was using it as a weapon. It was something that he really knew how to use.
As a shepherd, he would have used it to defend his flock.
Yes.
Wolves.
We had things when we were kids where you Y-shaped thing with a rubber band and you put a projectile in there and shoot at each other with a pretty dangerous little toy, but it's just a toy. But the slingshot is, to compare in modern terms, is a very sophisticated weapon.
Yeah, so I want to go back to our original question, right? Of now that we've kind of studied giants within our tradition, now that we've studied them in non-threatening ways to the Jews, right? That Moses wasn't particularly fearful of most of the giants. The Israelites were able to defeat them in battle. Why then did it completely change the story of the scouts when the scouts raised their voices and said, there are giants in the land, they're going to devour us, we have to turn around? And the Israelites said, you're right, we do. Why do you think that came up that way?
Well, one of the things I was thinking is that Moses had such a close relationship with God, and he knew that when God was with them, they would be protected. So it was his faith that took away the fear, or maybe he had the fear, but he was able to overcome the fear because he knew that God would create these miracles, like the temple with the Maccabees and in the Israel war, those kinds of things that seem impossible. But yet, with his trust and faith in the Almighty, he was able to trust that and not be afraid and know to go in and that they would be protected.
So that makes perfect sense with regard to Moses. What about the larger Jewish people? Because there were several places in the Torah where it says, okay, the Israelites went in, you overcame Shion, you overcame this group. Why then, with these particular giants in the land of Israel, was the narrative entirely different?
It could have been war. We read them fighting a lot. Looking at some insurmountable odds, they may decide that they really want to do this now.
I've always said that the people came out of Egypt always had a slave mentality. It had to change. It had to be new people, and it had to be without Moses too. It had to be different. They had to begin to face youth, young people who took 40 years to really build up courage and fortitude, to build up new leadership, to have faith in themselves. It took that long. And with the old people around, it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you, Larry, is that it wasn't necessarily the giants of the land. It was the giants in their mind that they couldn't get over.
Right?
There needed to be new people who weren't so rooted in this sense of being a wanderer, being a people without a land. It had to be people who were able to get over that so that they could enter this new kind of existence of having a land.
And you see that at the end of Deuteronomy, when choices come up, people become innovative, like Gad and Reuben. They began thinking of where they want to
That's
settle,
so casual.
and they begin to negotiate basically with God. So they're taking charge. They're getting ready to do it without Moses.
Yeah. I mentioned to some of you that I've been taking part in a conference this week with the Hartman Institute. And one of the key pieces of the Hartman Institute is talking about Israel, talking about our love for Israel, talking about our challenges with Israel, right? And one of the topics of conversation has been the fact that when Israel is an aspiration, we have moral high ground because we didn't have a land, because we were a persecuted people. And so that meant that we could have the sympathy of the world after the Holocaust, right? When we go into the land, when all of a sudden we have power, we lose that moral high ground. Now, it's not, we shouldn't have the land of Israel because people will dislike us because all of a sudden we have some power, but there is something that is a really big step in terms of going into the land and finally having this homeland. There is something that the Israelites are giving up in going into the land that perhaps at this moment they just simply were not willing or ready to do. And I know there's a lot more there, and that's a very superficial kind of outlook of very complicated things, but I think it's important to kind of keep in mind. Any other ideas about why the Israelites might not have? Steve, did you have something you wanted to say? Okay, I thought you were saying something.
I would just say that I think we as humans, we have fears. And you know, even though the Israelites had seen all the miracles at Sinai and everything, they kept falling away from their, you know, from what they saw and not remembering. And then you know, these fears grow within inside.
Yeah, fears can get the better of us. And I mean, that's another really, really important piece to remember here is that they make it sound like it's because of the giants, as if giants are an anomaly. They are not an anomaly. We see evidence that the giants are not an anomaly because they've shown up in so many different cases in our Torah, right? We might not have had many opportunities to study them, but they're right there in so many different contexts. Story of Abraham, story of Noah, right in the very beginning of creation, and other times to boot, right? It's the context in which it is. It's the frame of mind. Because those giants weren't a threat to Moses and the Israelites and all of the other contexts. But here, as they're about to enter the land of Israel, as they're the only thing that is standing in their way of entering Israel is these giants, all of a sudden they become that much greater. It's that fear. It's I'm not ready to do it. I need an excuse. There are giants. I'm fearing them. This is the reason you should fear them too. And I think what a human thing to do that, isn't it? Right? Like in some contexts, we can have this gargantuous task ahead of ourselves. And we're like, all right, I'm ready to jump in. I can do this. And that very same thing can come up another time, but we're not in that frame of mind and it's insurmountable. And it's up to us to decide what are we willing and what are we ready to take on in different contexts? Where do we let our fear get the best of us? Where are we going to allow ourselves to really put our all and take risks to overcome it? So I think that this can just give us a lot of food for thought as to the giants in our own lives. What are the things that we are fearful of? What are the things that lay before us? And where do we allow these giants to take up so much space in our minds that it's insurmountable and that we can't move forward, that we need more time to wander around the desert before we're ready for that particular battle? And where are the times that we are ready and we're willing to just jump in? And I think that if we can take the time to think through all of that, then perhaps we can find strength within ourselves that we might not have otherwise realized was there.
I think because of fear, we seek out certainty, and certainty robs us of opportunities to grow, opportunities to be free, opportunities to make a difference. So fear is something that we should not settle for certainty to overcome fear. We should venture forth.
Yeah, when we can, right? But we're not ready for every battle all the time, and that's okay too.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Pick your battles.
Rabbi, before you go, you mentioned something about the conference and about this being an existential time or really critical, super critical issue. Do you want to say a sentence or two about that concern?
There's a lot of different debates that are going on. What I've been picking up, what I've been struggling with so much within myself, quite honestly, since the war that happened just a couple months ago in Israel. And what I've been noticing within the Jewish community is an inability and an unwillingness to have conversations. That there are many people who are more on the right who say, if you criticize Israel in any way, whether you are Jewish or not, you are anti-Semitic, you are not part of this group, I don't want to have a conversation with you, I'm excluding you. And there are people on the left who say, I'm critical of Israel, and therefore, I don't know that I should have any relationship with Israel at all. And there needs to be conversations because it is absolutely imperative that there can be multiple ways to love Israel, and also that we foster a love of Israel in every person in our community. And by not having the conversations that need to be had, we are doing ourselves and our fellow Jews in Israel a really big disservice. And so the existential crisis that I think is going on within the Jewish community is, how do we foster those conversations in a way that can have everyone at the table and can honor and respect where everyone is in this moment? Not an easy thing to do.
We locally, before the pandemic, we had a conversation very similar to this subject, and the temple leadership, they held it in secret. They would not allow people in who were not members of the temple, who had made prearranged prearrangements to get into the discussion. And one of the things that came out of it says, well, if you criticize Israel, don't criticize it outside of our house. I mean, and right, it just got me thinking along the lines you're talking about now. You can't say anything, as it might be misinterpreted or used against this kind of thing. And I thought that completely very unusual, but I'm glad to hear that there's a lot of attention.
Right. And that argument that you're giving, Irv, is something that has been an argument in the Jewish community, and that I had even made in some contexts in the past. But as there's news articles coming in the New York Times, even yesterday, right, all these images of people in Gaza who are killed and who are hurt, as those things are on front pages of newspapers, we can't say, let's have these conversations behind doors. We have to have conversations with one another in a way that's accessible, because otherwise many Jews aren't even going to walk through the doors. So this is really, really challenging stuff. And that's why I thought it was incredibly important to be a part of this conference this week to grapple with it, because I think that there is work that I and other rabbis and other people in the Jewish community need to do in order to bring more people to the table and to have these courageous conversations. So I know that took us off topic, and sorry, I can get off my little soapbox now, but that's where I've been for the past few days, mentally.
We missed Rabbi Catherine today.
Oh, Rabbi Catherine?
Yeah.
Yeah, she told me that there was something she was going to be doing this week, and I think she'll be back next week. Yeah, I can't remember exactly what it was, but yes, it's always wonderful when she's here, surely.
Rabbi Cassi, I'm curious, since you're talking about us having more open conversations within the community about those sorts of things, is there anything within our own community for where we will actually be free to have those conversations? I just ask because obviously it's been more difficult during a pandemic.
Yeah, so we did have one opportunity last year, and part of the thinking right now is exactly that. Where can we have these conversations? We haven't got, I personally haven't gotten that far into it yet, but it is exactly the right question to be asking.
Okay, looking forward to it.
Yeah. Wonderful. So any kind of last thoughts, either based on all of this from the past 5 minutes or on the study of David and Goliath and the giants in our midst, that anyone would like to offer?
I've been away for a number of years living here in Oregon, but are we doing any ecumenical kind of stuff with other faith leaders, and are we having any events that more than some of our community, other religions or faiths that we communicate with?
So through the SCIC, there's a lot of programs, and I encourage you to reach out to that. The temple is certainly very supportive of that. I've spoken at a bunch of them. I spoke at one recently. And we don't have any specific event that's coming up right now, but there are periodically, there are different things. So we'll let you know when there are.
Thank you.
Okay, awesome. It has been such a delight, as always, to be with all of you. And I look forward to seeing you next week when we continue in the book of Deuteronomy. So have a great week if I don't see you beforehand. And even if I do. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you.